All right, so get ready because we're diving deep into Rob Zombie's 31.
Oh, yeah.
This 2016 horror film
Okay.
throws kind of like grindhouse aesthetics into a brutal survival game.
Right.
And we've got a stack of articles, reviews,
Yeah.
behind-the-scenes stuff.
Interesting.
Really get a feel for what Zombie was going for.
Yeah, it's interesting how Zombie takes this simple concept, a game of survival,
Right.
infuses it with all these layers of social commentary.
Yeah.
He's drawing on influences from classic horror, but he's also weaving in elements of exploitation cinema and even a bit of like social satire.
Yeah, you can definitely see those influences, like in the way he sets up the game. Halloween 1976, a group of carnival workers on the road, and suddenly they're abducted
Oh, wow.
and thrown into this terrifying game called 31.
And the setting itself is so important.
Yeah.
That labyrinthine industrial complex that feels like a twisted funhouse designed for one purpose: to break these characters down both physically and psychologically.
Oh, absolutely. And then you have the killers themselves. Sick head, psycho head, schizo head, sex head, and death head, each one more grotesque and theatrical than the last.
Oh, yeah.
Almost like a macabre circus act.
Right. And they're not just like random acts of violence.
Right.
They're carefully orchestrated
Yeah.
with costumes, weapons, even personalities designed to maximize the terror and the spectacle. You can really see Zombie's background in music videos and stage shows coming through in the way he presents these characters.
Oh, for sure. And then there's Doomhead, the grand finale.
Right.
He's like the embodiment of nihilism and chaos. Just the way he's introduced that opening scene where he delivers this monologue before brutally murdering a priest. Chilling stuff.
It sets the tone for the entire film.
Yeah.
This isn't a slasher flick where the violence is just implied or happening off screen. Zombie wants you to see it, to feel it, to understand the brutality of the game and the stakes for these characters.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
But beyond the shock value, there's a lot to unpack in terms of the film's themes. Survival's obviously a big one. But did you pick up on any other recurring ideas or motifs as you were going through the materials?
I think one of the most interesting aspects of 31 is how Zombie explores class warfare.
Yep.
You have these wealthy elites who have orchestrated this entire game, and they're essentially treating the carnival workers like disposable pawns for their own amusement.
It's like he's taking that age-old horror trope of rich people hunting poor people for sport
Yeah.
and injecting it with this really dark, cynical humor.
Exactly. And it's not just about the violence itself, it's about the power dynamics at play, the way that the wealthy characters are able to manipulate and exploit the less fortunate for their own sick entertainment.
And it all plays out against this backdrop of extreme violence. Zombie's known for his use of practical effects, and 31 is no exception. Did any of the scenes or descriptions in the articles you read stand out to you in terms of how he utilizes those effects to create a specific mood or feeling?
Well, there's a scene in the film where one of the killers, schizohead, attacks with a chainsaw. The article described how Zombie used practical effects to create a truly visceral experience. They talked about the weight of the chainsaw,
Right.
the splatter of blood, the sheer physicality of the attack. It's not just about showing violence.
Yeah.
It's about making you feel it.
It sounds like he wants the audience to be right there in the thick of it, experiencing the same terror and desperation as the characters.
That's one way to put it, for sure.
And I think it's interesting to consider how that approach to violence ties back into the themes we were discussing earlier. It's not just gratuitous.
Right.
It's meant to highlight the brutal reality of the game
Yeah.
and the lengths to which these characters are forced to go to survive.
Exactly. It forces you to confront the darkness, the ugliness.
And you can't talk about 31 without mentioning how it was produced. Zombie actually turned to crowdfunding
Oh, wow.
through platforms like Fanback to get this project off the ground.
Interesting.
I can't think of another director at his level who's done that. Do any of the articles offer insights into why he chose that route?
Several of them mention that Zombie wanted complete creative freedom, and crowdfunding allowed him to bypass the traditional studio system and its restrictions. He knew this film was going to be controversial, and he didn't want to compromise his vision.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially with a film like this one, which definitely pushes the boundaries of what's considered acceptable in mainstream horror.
And by going directly to his fans, he was able to make the film he wanted to make without having to answer to studio executives or worry about pleasing a wider audience.
Speaking of audience, I'm curious to hear about the reception. What kind of reactions did 31 get from critics and viewers? Were they all on board with Zombie's vision?
Well, as you might expect with a Rob Zombie film, the reception was a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some critics loved the film's energy and its homage to grindhouse horror, while others found it excessive and gratuitous.
It's interesting how those criticisms often seem to follow Zombie's work, isn't it? This constant debate over style versus substance, exploitation versus artistry.
It's almost like a recurring theme in his career.
But even the critics who weren't fans of the film as a whole, they did praise Richard Brake's performance as Doomhead.
Oh, yeah.
He seems to have really struck a chord with viewers.
Absolutely. Brake brought this chillingly realistic intensity to the role,
Yeah.
making Doomhead one of the most memorable horror villains in recent years.
So what about the fans? Did Zombie's core audience embrace the film?
Yeah, it seems like the hardcore fans, especially those who appreciate his earlier work, were pretty receptive to 31. They saw it as a return to his roots, a raw and uncompromising horror film that didn't shy away from pushing boundaries.
That makes sense. But for viewers who weren't familiar with Zombie's style, it's probably a bit of a shock to the system.
Yeah, for those going in blind, 31 probably wasn't the best introduction to his work. It's definitely a film that requires a certain taste for the extreme and the absurd.
All right, so we've covered the concept, the plot, the themes, the production, and even the initial reactions. Now it's time to dig a little deeper into what makes 31 tick. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this film fits into the larger context of Zombie's career. Would you say it's a continuation of his previous work or a departure in some way?
That's a great question, and one that I think requires a closer look at his filmography.
Let's do it.
Okay.
We're going to dive right into that.
Yeah.
So let's get into it.
All right, so we were going to dive into how 31 fits into the larger tapestry of his work.
Yeah, it seems like 31 has a lot in common with some of his earlier films, like House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects.
Okay.
But there are also some elements that feel unique to this film.
Yeah, it's a fascinating evolution, isn't it? You can definitely see the through lines, the gritty aesthetic, the fascination with the grotesque, and the unflinching portrayal of violence, all hallmarks of Zombie style.
But there's a sense in 31 that he's refining his craft, focusing his vision. It's like he took the raw energy of those earlier films and channeled it into something more deliberate, more psychologically driven.
I think that's a really insightful observation.
Right,
It's
yeah.
like he's not just trying to shock us anymore.
Wow.
He's trying to get under our skin to make us confront our own capacity for darkness.
Right. And that's where the themes of survival and nihilism really come into play.
Yeah.
Remember that scene where Charlie chooses to fight back against the killers despite knowing the odds are stacked against her?
Oh, yeah.
That's a perfect example of Zombie juxtaposing the human will to survive with the overwhelming sense of nihilism that pervades the film.
It's a brilliant scene, and Shamoon Zombie's performance is so raw and powerful.
Yeah.
She's not a victim, she's a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, and you even see with some of the other characters, even in the face of certain death, they find ways to resist, to assert their own humanity.
Exactly. They cling to those small acts of defiance, those moments of connection, even as the world around them crumbles.
And that brings us to another interesting point.
Yeah.
The characters. While the killers are obviously memorable, I was surprised by how much I connected with some of the victims.
Me too.
Right.
They're not just disposable pawns in this game. They're fully realized individuals with their own backstories, motivations, and relationships.
And that's what makes their fates all the more tragic.
Right.
They're not just nameless victims. They're people who had lives, dreams, and families.
Exactly. And Zombie doesn't shy away from showing us their humanity, even as he subjects them to these horrific acts of violence.
It's a difficult balance to strike,
Yeah.
but I think he pulls it off. The violence isn't gratuitous. It serves a purpose. It's meant to highlight the brutality of the game and the psychological toll it takes on these characters.
Right. And it's also worth noting that the violence in 31 is often stylized and theatrical, almost like a Grand Guignol performance.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
The killers are like grotesque caricatures. Their costumes and weapons exaggerated to the point of absurdity. And their deaths are often over the top, almost operatic in their violence.
Exactly. It's not just about realism. It's about creating a heightened sense of dread and unease. And Zombie's use of practical effects really enhances that feeling of visceral horror.
Speaking of practical effects, remember that scene where Schizohead attacks Roscoe with the chainsaw?
Oh, yeah.
I read in one of the articles that Zombie insisted on using a real chainsaw with all the weight and power that entails to make the scene as authentic and terrifying as possible.
It's those little details that make such a difference, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
not just about showing violence. It's
Yeah.
about making the audience feel it.
Yeah, it's about immersing them in this nightmarish world, making them complicit in the horror.
It's disturbing, but also strangely compelling. It's like you can't look away even as you want to.
And I think that speaks to Zombie's skill as a filmmaker.
Right.
He's able to create these truly unsettling experiences that stay with you long after the credits roll.
It's not just mindless gore. There's a thoughtfulness behind it, an intentionality.
And that brings us back to the question of how 31 fits into Zombie's overall filmography.
Right.
Do you see it as a culmination of his previous work or a new direction entirely?
I think it's a bit of both. 31 is definitely an evolution, but it also builds upon the foundation he established in his earlier films.
So it's not a radical departure, but rather a refinement of his style and his thematic concerns.
Exactly. He's still exploring the dark underbelly of American culture, the violence and depravity that lurk beneath the surface. But in 31, there's a sharper focus, a more mature understanding of his craft.
I agree. And I think that's evident in the way he uses the visual language of film, the camera angles, the lighting, the editing, to create a truly unsettling and hypnotic experience.
There's a scene in the film right before the game begins where the camera slowly pans across the faces of the victims, capturing their fear and desperation. It's such a simple shot, but it's so effective in building tension and establishing the emotional stakes.
It's moments like that that elevate 31 beyond just a typical slasher
Yeah.
flick. Zombie's clearly thinking about how he's framing each shot, how he's using sound and music to create a specific mood and tone.
And that attention to detail, that willingness to experiment with the form is what makes his work so interesting. Even if you don't always agree with his choices, you have to admire his commitment to his vision.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the themes, the characters, the style, and how 31 fits into Zombie's filmography.
Right.
But what about its reception?
Yeah.
How did critics and audiences react to this wild ride? Did it resonate with viewers, or was it met with resistance?
Well, as you can imagine with a film like this, the reactions were quite diverse. Let's unpack that a bit further.
So we were about to unpack the reactions to 31.
Oh yeah, 31 definitely sparked some strong reactions.
Yeah.
Pretty typical for a Rob Zombie film.
Right.
It seems like people either love his work or they hate it. There's not a lot of middle ground.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
He's not exactly known for subtlety or restraint.
Right, and 31 is no exception. It's a film that's designed to push buttons to provoke a reaction.
So let's talk about some of those reactions.
Yeah.
What were the major points of praise and criticism that you came across in the reviews?
Well, as you might expect, the violence was a major talking point.
Yeah.
Some critics praised Zombie's use of practical effects, saying it gave the film a visceral, almost tangible quality. They appreciated the way he used gore, not just for shock value, but to highlight the brutality of the game and the desperation of the characters.
I can see that those scenes are definitely not for the squeamish, but there's a certain artistry to the way they're shot and edited. It's not just about blood and guts. It's about creating a specific mood and tone.
Exactly. But of course, other critics found the violence to be excessive and gratuitous. They argued that it detracted from the story and ultimately served only to shock and disgust the audience.
It's interesting, isn't it? That fine line between art and exploitation, between pushing boundaries and crossing them.
Yeah.
Where do you land on that debate?
Honestly, I think it's a matter of personal taste. Some viewers are drawn to that kind of extreme horror, while others find it repulsive. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a spectrum of responses to this kind of material, and what's disturbing to one person might be thrilling to another.
That's a fair point.
Hmm.
And I think it speaks to Zombie's skill as a provocateur. He's not afraid to make people uncomfortable, to challenge their expectations of what a horror film can be.
And that's part of what makes his work so fascinating to discuss.
Right.
It forces us to confront our own boundaries, our own tolerance for violence and depravity.
Right. It sparks these interesting conversations about censorship, artistic freedom, and the role of horror in society.
Mm.
But beyond the violence, were there any other aspects of the film that elicited strong reactions?
Well, the portrayal of class warfare was another point of contention.
Okay.
Some viewers saw it as a powerful social commentary, highlighting the way the wealthy elite exploit and manipulate the less fortunate for their own amusement.
I can definitely see that interpretation.
Mm.
The way the game is set up, pitting these working-class carnival folk against each other in a fight to the death, it's hard not to see the parallels to real-world power dynamics.
But other viewers felt that the social commentary was heavy-handed and ultimately undermined the film's effectiveness as a horror story. They argued that Zombie was trying to do too much and that the political message got lost in the midst of all the gore and mayhem.
It's a valid criticism. It's always a tricky balance when you're trying to incorporate social commentary into a genre film. Do you think Zombies struck that balance effectively in 31?
I think it's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Some viewers will appreciate the layers of meaning he's trying to convey, while others will find it distracting or preachy. I think it depends on your own personal perspective and what you're looking for in a film.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems like 31, like most of Zombies' work, is a film that's meant to be debated and discussed. It's not just passive entertainment. It's an experience that's designed to provoke thought and conversation.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so compelling. It's not just a horror film, it's a reflection of our own anxieties and fears, our own fascination with violence and darkness.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 31,
Yeah.
what final takeaway would you offer our listener? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember about this film?
I think the most important thing to remember is that 31 is a film that defies easy categorization. It's a horror film, yes, but it's also a social commentary, a character study, and a visual masterpiece. It's a film that demands to be seen, discussed, and debated, and it's a film that, love it or hate it, will stay with you long after the credits have rolled.
I couldn't have said it better myself. 31 is a wild, unforgettable ride, and I encourage you to experience it for yourself and form your own opinions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.